Good evening. I am Sean Walter, and this is The Invited Guest. Anna twitched aside a thin lace curtain to view the gravel drive up to the manor, expecting at any moment to spot her guest coming along the pathway. Will he have a coach and six? A single stallion, she thought. She waited at the window for a moment, her breath fogging the glass that divided her dining room with its warm hearth and the barren winter cold outside. Barren winter. That's what her father always called it. Blue skies and starry nights, but too cold for snow. Absolutely nothing would grow. The world was simply bleak, gray, and inhospitable to all life. She turned back to the dining room, inspecting the grand table capable of seating 30, set only for two. Crystal glasses for wine, antique silver mugs for beer, gold-encased sherry glasses, the finest china, solid silver flatware, everything to impress her awaited guest. Satisfied, she passed through the dining room, down the hall, past the parlor, the sitting room, the library, and turned to the kitchen. She'd had the cook teach her everything she could over the last several months in preparation for this night. She learned how to build and keep the fire in the stove, how to passably prepare goose and pigeon, a myriad of soups, meat pies, and a few simple desserts. The cook had looked skeptical when she had made her request, but asked no questions of her mistress. Anna doubled her salary for her discretion. After all, how could she ever show her face in society again if it got out that she had started cooking? Of course, it had to be done. There was nothing for it. The meal had to be prepared by the host, or the calling would fail, having offended the guest. Anna checked that everything was prepared correctly, going as far as to taste the courses. Not that she had the first clue what to do if they had tasted a little off, but simply because she had seen the cook do it often, and always with a small silver spoon. And, like the cook, she put the spoon into the pockets of her apron she wore over her evening clothes. She had no idea why, but that certainly seemed to be part of the tasting process. The cooking finished, she put each dish onto an individual serving platter or bowl. Having given the entire house staff the night off, she made several trips up and down the hall presenting the food on the dinner table. She lit a single solitary candle in the middle of it, as was traditional. She then looked over her spread, checking the dishes, counting them off on her fingers. She couldn't get past the feeling that she'd forgotten something. She paced for a moment along the table, making sidelong glances at the food there. She stopped at the window and peered through the curtains once again, but nothing moved in that bitter, desolate cold. Suddenly it struck her. Napkins! She hurried to the linen closet and grabbed her softest silk cloths. She'd always thought them impractical and decadent, since they were always such a nuisance to keep on your lap, and the washerwomen always seemed to destroy them. She sighed, took up two of the finest cloths, and meandered back to the dining room. She was stopped at the closed spring-hinged door to the dining room by the scrape and whine of cutlery upon fine china and the low roar of a small crowd enjoying themselves from the other side. She paused, afraid of what she might find. Has the guest finally arrived? She hoped, though the thought made her shiver. She steeled her nerves, removed her apron, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The noise died as swiftly as a candle in the wind, leaving strange, bodiless echoes and the feeling of closeness in the empty room. The food was untouched, the plates unmoved. She trembled and hugged herself against the cold. Cold, she thought. Why is it cold? Her gaze fell to the curtains along the window, which fluttered and receded. A breeze wafted in with the crisp scent of winter. The windows were open. Slowly, carefully, she moved to close them, but as she reached out to close the pane, a single solid knock stormed through the house. Anna stood motionless. Another solemn knock came, louder than before. Anna, full of a sudden bowel-tightening dread, walked to the front entryway, careful of every step, deeply aware of the sound of her own breathing. As she approached the door, a repetitive hail of pounding erupted on the woodwork, shaking the walls themselves. Anna, screaming from her very soul, threw the door open with one violent movement. And there she found nothing. The front steps were gone. The yard, her brother's prized hedgerow, the entry statues, everything was gone. She looked out into an abyss of nothing, her mind reeling. Something beckoned from the black, something inviting, enticing, cunning, but she dared not go. She slammed the door shut and flung herself at the key in the lock. She leaned there, panting, secure behind her thick front door, until the hairs on the back of her neck began to stand on end. She turned around. The creature stood at an imposing height, clad in a dark and tattered riding cloak, the excess of which lay piled in a heap around his boots. And what boots they were! Dark and worn leather, clad in strips of rusted and pitted iron. Her eyes searched for a face buried among the dark folds of his hood, but were only met with a sack of burlap, tied in place by a rope around his neck, like the pox-bearers wear when moving the diseased corpses from the streets. Anna, unable to breathe, fell against the doorway. Her guest had arrived. He didn't move to greet her or introduce himself. He stood perfectly still, the ambient noise of the room seeming to die in the folds of his cloak. Anna pushed herself against the door and slid her way up to her feet, never looking away from her guest. Please, sir," she stammered. "May I take your cloak?" The guest moved its head slowly up, then down. Anna cautiously moved toward him, her limbs shaking, her breath visibly rolling from her lips in the chill air. She marched behind the motionless creature and pulled at his cloak. It fell heavily in her arms, filling her lungs with the stench of rot, of unwashed bodies, and, finally, of horse. She rolled the cloak as best as she could manage and placed it on a small bench in the entryway, then turned back to her guest. "Would you please follow me?" she quivered, leading the way to the dining room. Her guest's heavy footsteps followed her closely, urging her to walk faster. She picked up her pace, but the boots seemed to always be a half step faster. She increased her pace yet again, lest she be trampled by the large, hob-nailed masses, but no matter how fast she went, the footsteps behind her went faster. She reached the doors to the dining room at a full run, and burst through them, only to find her guest already seated, quietly, at the head of the table. She looked behind her into the hallway, and nothing looked back at her. She closed the doors and turned to her guest. The full chill of the outdoors had penetrated the room. She silently cursed herself for not closing the window when she had the chance. She looked at her guest, searching for any sign of discomfort, but he remained, as ever, motionless. The very essence of his breath never escaped the sack over his face, if he ever breathed at all. Anna moved forward and poured him a glass of red wine, hoping he wouldn't drink it, fearing what might lie beneath the rough cloth. "Would you care for some roast goose, Lord?" she asked. The creature made no indication either way, but Anna gathered a plate and put some of the goose upon it anyway. She then turned to her guest once again. "Eel soup?" Her guest cocked his head to one side, as if contemplating or confused, but made no other movement. Anna dished a helping of eel soup and, after a moment's hesitation, a portion of every other course, and placed it all before him. He sat with his gloved hands resting against the edge of the table, seemingly at ease, but she could feel his eyes upon her, never leaving her, as she moved from dish to dish. Finally, her host's duties finished, she sat down at the chair nearest to his right hand, taking nothing for herself but a full glass of port. "He may not eat," Anna recalled the wives' tales she had heard as a girl, "but you must serve him as if you were serving the king himself. Remember your manners." Anna felt her flesh begin to pimple on her arms, and she glanced at the billowing curtains, wondering if the darkness she had seen from the door still waited outside. Turning to her guest, she asked, "Have you traveled far?" The creature turned its head to face her. In a voice like an earthquake under an ocean of time, it spoke. "I have traveled for eternity, and not at all." The words plucked the air from Anna's lungs. She braced herself on the table and took a deep, unsteady breath. Once again somewhat composed, she looked at her guest's plate. "Does the food meet with your approval, Lord?" Her guest reached out and rested his ancient gloved hand above the plates and bowls before him. Anna watched as the color of the food seemed to drain, slowly, from every morsel. By the time the creature removed his hand, nothing remained but ash. "It is acceptable," he said, his voice seeming to calm. Anna bowed from her chair, once again recalling the elderly woman she had heard the summoning tale from. If he eats, all the better. No being is not comforted by food. After the meal, you may bring up why you called him, but don't throw yourself out there like a twopenny whore. Tact, girl, that's what you need." She took a deep breath. "Lord," she started. "You wish to ask me a favor?" the guest interrupted. Anna nodded. "You're not the first." "Lord," she paused, "I was told you have the power to see beyond the veil, to bring the souls of the departed back for a time." The creature nodded, slowly. "My father and brother, Lord, they—" Her voice betrayed her, not allowing her to continue. "I just want to know what became of them." Her guest tilted his head at her in contemplation, the frayed burlap strands staring at her, weighing her, judging her. "You are aware of the price?" "Yes, Lord," she replied, tears flowing down her face, unheeded. The creature stood and walked to the window, his leather mantle betraying thin shoulders underneath. He opened the curtains, revealing the nothing that waited there. He reached into the frigid black, into the barren cold, and pulled forth a closed fist. Returning to his seat, he turned to Anna and opened his gloved hand. A glow, so slight that it almost vanished in the weak candlelight, emerged from his palm. It floated through his fingers, swaying this way and that, as if unused to travel. It passed over the chairs opposite Anna and split into two. Each glowing shape descended into a seat, and as they touched the old moldering fabric, they took shape. Anna's father, a rotund man, sat nearest the creature, his throat showing the horrible bruising, torn flesh, and wadded sinew of repeated axe strikes. Her brother, Gabriel, appeared in the next chair, He had a hole straight through his chest. Anna wept. "Anna?" her father called, his voice hoarse and guttural. "What have you done? Why are we here?" I had to know," she sobbed. "I had to see for myself where you went." "Went?" Gabriel scoffed. "We're dead, Anna. Where would we go?" But the priests, they said that—" "They were wrong," her father interrupted. "There is nothing. Nothing beyond. Nothing forever." "But where have you been?" As one, they both turned to her guest. "In his care," they said. The creature remained motionless, staring at Anna. "You keep them?" He nodded. "You tricked me." "You invited me here. You bartered my favor," the creature stated, simply. "You wished to know what happened to them. I have shown you." The room grew colder still. Anna looked past her brother and tried to see the window and curtains behind him, but instead she saw nothing. The darkness seemed to dance beyond them. But I wanted—" "Live your life, girl. Remember us, but live." Her father reached across the table and touched her cheek, unable to disturb the tear rolling down it. "It's time." The guest stood, and Anna knew the visit was over. "Goodbye, Anna," Gabriel said, and smiled at her for the last time. The darkness engulfed the room, gripping Anna in a breath of air as cold as misery. She awoke in the dining room, standing at the curtain, peering out into the yard, waiting for a guest who had already come and gone. She wept. In the coming spring, on an expedition to recover the remains of her brother and father, Anna's carriage overturned on a seemingly clear country road. Her driver claimed that the team of horses became spooked by a sudden cold wind, but by all accounts the day was warm and pleasant. Whatever the cause, the accident left Anna maimed and scarred. Years passed. Suitors came and went, seeking Anna's hand and inheritance, regardless of her deformities. But with every coming winter, it became clearer that no one would ever make the girl smile. A chill had taken root in her eyes. A barren winter where absolutely nothing, not even joy, would grow.